First of all, as you can see, the title has changed a bit. I hope it has become a bit more narrow, a bit more precise. But so my name is Toivanen. I'm from the University of Turku, Finland, and also affiliated with the EHESS in France at the moment. And first of all, I have a confession to make. So I'm not at all a scholar specialized in genocide. So this is a sort of a sidetrack that I'm taking from my current project that deals with Kurdish diaspora political mobilization processes in France and in Finland. And this is something that I would say has come up during the empirical data collection. So people who talk about Halabja and who talk about the Anfal campaign and the diaspora Kurds and who want to have Halabja recognized as a genocide. So I'm a migration scholar. So I think I'll be learning much more from you than vice versa. So I'm here today to talk about the genocide recognition politics in diaspora. This is a very preliminary paper that hopefully one day will be published, and focusing on the case of Halabja and the Kurdish diaspora. And towards the end of my presentation, I wish to highlight a certain kind of conceptual tools or conceptual approaches that might be useful to understand how the genocide recognition politics are formulated in the diaspora context and how potentially those differ from genocide recognition politics in homeland context. So very briefly about the Kurdish diaspora in Europe. As you might already be familiar with that. So the Kurdish diaspora movement in Europe dates back to several decades and can be originated to the armed conflicts that have taken place in the regions where Kurdish speakers reside in Kurdistan, and to particular events. I won't be going into detail to that, but you have a little bit more information in the paper that I have sent to you earlier. So it is to some extent a long-standing diaspora community with subsequent generations, so second, third, and fourth generation coming about, and very much the diaspora formation is very much linked to the international displacement and exile, so forced displacement of the Kurdish populations from the Kurdish-speaking regions. So the estimates are very rough, since most countries do not collect statistics based on mother language, but on citizenship. So Kurds are usually classified as Iraqi, Turkish, or Iranian citizens, and so forth. But there are between 850,000 and 1.3 million Kurdish speakers living in diaspora, and of an ethno-national community that has been estimated to be between 25 to 40 million in total. And what is usually said to characterize the Kurdish diaspora is that it is politically quite active diaspora group to varying degrees depending on the national context, but still very much organized in different diaspora organizations, political organizations, associations, and so forth, and which is something also that continues in subsequent generations among the second and third generation Kurds. Something referring here to Abbas Vali, who has written lengthily about the collective identity construction among Kurds, who argues that the collective identity and belonging of Kurds in general draw from experiences of denial and resistance in host society. So that one of the central identity components in collective notions of Kurdish identity is rooted to this understanding of denial and resistance and being an oppressed minority and having faced persecution and exile and so forth. And why is this relevant? When we look at the diaspora context, it's one of the dominant identity narratives that you can find also in the diaspora context concerning Kurdish identities. For instance, there's Khalid Kayati, a diaspora Kurd himself, who argues that by the regular utterance, by the regular references to discrimination, the politics of denial, assimilation, persecution, etc., Anfal, which is part of the campaigns I'll be talking about today, gas attacks, forced displacement, the mainstream Kurdish diaspora discourse is a way not only of recalling those experiences of trauma and oppression, but also legitimizing a way of escaping them. So it's very much, in a sense, inherent to the understanding of Kurdish identity narratives in diaspora. And very briefly about the Anfal campaigns and Halabja. Most of you are probably familiar with this, so I won't go into detail in it either. So Anfal campaigns and Halabja particularly is one of the kind of emblematic events for Kurds and for diaspora Kurds as well, who aim to have it recognized as a genocide. An Anfal campaign, it's something that took place during the Iraq and Iran war in Anfal campaign that took place in 87, 88, and that consisted of 8 military offensives that physically destroyed thousands of villages, killed between 150 to 180 people, and left more than 180,000 missing. So it's a major event in that sense. And what has Halabja have to do with Anfal campaigns is that it's a chemical attack that took place in 88 to a Kurdish city in northern Iraq called Halabja, and where 8,000 people perished in one day. And it is something that is very frequently referenced to and very frequently brought up in the material that I have been dealing with, collected from diaspora Kurds. There was also in 2003, there was a monument of Halabja martyrs that was built in the city, and in 2006 a Ministry of Martyrs and Anfal Affairs that was created as part of the Kurdish regional government. So you have this de facto autonomous region in northern Iraq of KRG that is also pushing forward this genocide recognition politics that is very much operating in close cooperation with the diaspora groups, so in terms of lobbying practices, for instance. Although there are some fractions also at the local level, in Halabja, for instance, when the ministry was created, there were social unrest, people accusing the KRG of instrumentalizing Halabja and of taking advantage of the kind of genocide recognition politics without it directly benefiting the people who were actually affected by the Halabja gas bombing. So what are the kind of initiatives or politics that I'm focusing on in diaspora? There's to some extent, I wouldn't say that it's a large body of literature, but there are empirical case studies on how diaspora groups participate in genocide recognition initiatives. And some of the practices include, for instance, direct lobbying to local policymakers in the receiving society, so in this case in the European countries where diaspora communities reside, circulating petitions, organizing demonstrations, organizing awareness raising campaigns or artistic performances also, organizing commemoration events and so forth. So the meanings are very wide and also differ between the first generation and second generation members who might take a little different take on genocide recognition policies. And they can, when we're talking about the diaspora context, these initiatives take also place across the national borders, so the so-called transnational space is very significant in this regard. So through cross-border community networks that diaspora communities have, for instance, between France, the UK, Germany, the Nordic countries, and so forth, and in different online environments. And in that regard, the second generation plays quite a significant role. And some of the activities can be designed or coordinated by homeland actors, bureaus of representation that you have for KRG, for instance, but not always in a rosy way, so to say. So there might be fractions between the homeland actors and the diaspora groups in some cases. In the Kurdish case, what this means, there are, for instance, centers. There's CHAK, the Center of Halabja Against Genocide and Anfalization of the Kurds, that has been established already, I think, in 2001 in Europe by diaspora Kurds, which also also operates in several European countries. Commemoration events, exhibitions, and conferences, for instance, the one organized in 2003 at the European Parliament, that was very much organized by diaspora Kurds. And you have, I don't know if you can see the poster, but it's the Kurdish Genocide, was the title of the conference. And also exhibitions displaying photos that have been taken in the aftermath of the chemical attack. And also this kind of commemorations in public space. So this is a statue that was revealed in Hague in 2014. And it is a very, it's based on a very known photo that was taken just right after the attacks of a father holding his child. And it has led to some also results. So there's this internationalization of recognition initiative through awareness raising campaigns, for instance. And there is a formal recognition that has been taking place in Sweden and Norway, the parliaments that have recognized Halabja as a genocide in 2013 or 12, 12, and Britain in 2013. And this is very much could be credited to the efforts of the Kurdish diaspora groups. So I have 2 slides left, and this is the direction I'm moving towards at the moment. So like I said, it's a very preliminary study, but I've been looking at the practices and motives behind these recognition initiatives, what meanings might be attributed to them, and how does the context, especially in the diaspora, play in the formulation of these practices. So, for instance, in the Kurdish case, there is the long-standing settlement in diaspora. So you have decades of Kurdish diaspora settlement, of transnational organizations, of associations that are in place that facilitate this kind of cross-border organization of activities towards the recognition. It also allows greater mobilization across borders, and in terms of second and third generation, also the knowledge of host society context, so how to use different strategies for lobbying the local policymakers, how to use the institutional or political structures of the host society. So I won't be going into detail in that, but that's kind of a theoretical tool I'm trying to fit into this one. Of Toivanen, who is an Armenian-originated diaspora scholar who speaks of a transnation. Also, of course, there are many intertwined political interests when you look at genocide recognition initiatives and possible international aspirations, as in this case. So they can be an integral part when claiming right to self-determination. Since to some extent it yields to territorial integrity. Thank you. In case of genocide, so if you can claim to have been, if your community can claim to have been a target of a genocide, it can increase the chances of claiming greater self-determination in terms of territory. So Hachi writes about this, for instance. But it's not all about politics, of course. It's very much drawing on the collective memory. So, and in this, I make a distinction between the personal memory versus the more official and political memory, which is also highly selective. So, what kind of instances are being constructed and being used to political gains? But it's not all politics, like I said. There's also the issue of recognition, which is very much an emotional and very much a personal issue also, which is the very basic human need of being recognized, of being of equal worth. So Taylor talks about politics of recognition, for instance, which could be relevant to this case. And this, of course, in Taylor's case, in his famous book chapter, he relates this to collective identity, how recognition, or in many cases, the misrecognition of not being recognized, is central to identity construction. And this, as I showed you a bit, and something that I discuss more in the paper, is very relevant in the identity narratives in the Kurdish diaspora. And so this has been already argued by other authors, so I'm not claiming to argue this, but collective trauma in the case of the Kurdish diaspora movement is very much constitutive of identity, and Kayati refers to victim discourse narrative in the Kurdish diaspora, and the Halabja, the commemoration of Halabja is very much part of that kind of narrative. And since we're talking about transmission today, there is this very strong component of intergenerational transmission in genocide politics and genocide recognition politics, and how are the events, how have they been lived, or how are they reinterpreted by the second generation. So the second generation might even have a more symbolic approach to the events, as they have not lived them personally through, and might use different tools and strategies to push towards their recognition as well. So this is the last slide, and it's very much in process, but what I wanted to look at the temporal and spatial dynamics of how these genocide recognition initiatives come about, and how, when looking at these two dimensions, how we can flesh out something in terms of how are the practices formulated, what meanings are those practices invested with, and how does, especially in the context of the diaspora, how does the national or transnational context play when looking at how the initiatives come about. For instance, if you talk about temporality, how is collective memory, either personal or political memory, drawn upon? How is identity evoked in different practices? And here you have again this very significant intergenerational dimension. How is consciousness of what took place in Halabja or during the Anfal campaigns? How it is being passed on? How it is being interpreted and reconstructed also? And one of the examples of this, for instance, is from the Sweden diaspora youth who have organized different kind of awareness-raising campaigns towards the recognition. So a very direct lobbying also towards the MPs, but this kind of more grassroots level activities, for instance, organizing a demonstration, going on the streets and distributing apples to people who go by. And then telling what the smell of apples means to Kurds in the context of Halabja, and that's usually something that's being referenced to as the Halabja took place and the chemical attack took place. The survivors said that the city smelled like sweet apples in the morning because of the gas. So the memory of it also plays very much on the senses, but the memory of having smelled sweet apples on that morning that the gas attack took place, and then kind of passing or raising awareness of that via distributing apples to bypassers in Stockholm can be one efficient means to raise awareness, for instance, and to kind of make it more personal. And also temporalities visible in ethno-national motifs. For instance, how Halabja, when you have local homeland actors and diaspora actors who are pushing towards the recognition of a certain massacre as a genocide, it is also a way to create national calendar, to take certain dates and to take control of time in that way, since part of the nation state building processes, you have the creation of a national calendar. So commemorating Halabja annually is part of that kind. So that there's a temporal dimension in that as well, and via repetition. In terms of spatiality, so I intend to look at how these practices come about in particular national context. For instance, how does it differ when diaspora Kurds organize in Sweden or in Finland, or when they do so in the UK or in the French context? So what are the political, institutional structures, civil society spaces that facilitate or that hinder such organizing practices, and what are also the state's different responses to those activities, to such initiatives? And this is something that I write a little bit more about in the paper, about the questions of liability. To what extent have the states in which the diaspora communities are making these recognition claims have been liable or responsible or taking part in facilitating such attacks. And this was the case, for instance, in France and in Germany, where in France the diaspora Kurds have actually sued French companies who have sold those components of gas to Iraq just before the attacks took place. So this very much plays into the national context of to what extent are those claims recognized and to what extent are those claims also successful, and how those are kind of displayed. And also in terms of spatiality, the understanding the transnational organization, and here you again have the diaspora context in a sense, and how to mobilize in this transnational space. And one of the examples that I came across during my PhD study that focused on the second generation of Kurds in Finland was that there was an initiative of second generation Kurds who took their bikes and left from Turku, which is a southwestern city in Finland, to Helsinki with their bikes that had flags of Kurdistan and flags of Finnish flags, and rendered a petition to the parliament. And so that was very well documented and so forth online. And then did the same thing in Halabja. So went to Erbil or Havler, and also on bikes left to Halabja and visited the memorial. And they were kind of doing this in a transnational, so they wanted to kind of synchronize their events in Finland and in the Kurdish region to raise awareness of Halabja. And this is very much how the spatiality also in terms of displacement and exile, the condition of being exiled, which not only is part of the identity construction processes, but is also very much included in the genocide recognition politics. For instance, the young people that I interviewed in Finland were telling me that, well, we haven't experienced the Halabja ourselves, but we situate our stories in the context of Halabja and Anfal campaigns, because it is something that potentially set into motion massive displacement. So the reason why we are now in Finland and why we are living here and having the citizenship and so forth is due to those events. So those become kind of constitutive of their narratives of where they belong and how they negotiate identity. And also this temporal and spatial dimensions, I don't want to treat them kind of like two separate things because they very much intertwine. For instance, the commemorations that take place in public spaces, so claiming space, for instance, in the case of the statue that was revealed in Hague in 2014, which very much relies on the collective memory and commemoration, so drawing from that. So, but also it is intertwines in a quite interesting way with claiming public space and recognition and visibility in such space. So these are the kind of like theoretical stepping stones or kind of conceptual stepping stones with what I'm working at the moment to look more specifically at practices. What motives or interests lie behind those practices of genocide recognition, and how does the diaspora context play a role in that regard? So, yeah, I use the one last sentence that I have probably to. If you're interested in comparative studies, I think the comparative lens of how diaspora groups organize in different contexts towards the genocide recognition initiatives, I think that could flesh out some very interesting insights in terms of how temporalities and spatialities come about. That's the literature, and I can't pronounce that, but yeah.